This really brings us to the role of the citizen as we're talking about how our governments can respond. And Heather, I'd like to ask you how you see the opportunities for engaging citizens, making them more aware, so that our voters vote in governments that are working with business and being progressive on this, and also getting at the inequality issues that are built into this.
Sure. So, you know, what's happened over the last 5 or 7 years, and I'll echo this later when I give a PowerPoint presentation, is that we've moved from kind of top-down leadership in social movements to being able to have more distributed leadership in social movements. And so what happens is that because we have access to Facebook and Twitter, and you know, we've all got an incredible amount of information right in our pockets, we can self-organize more easily now than we ever have been able to before. And even in countries that traditionally has been not as much freedom of information, that's starting to sort of break apart too. And there's a lot of work being done in Iran, for example, an alternative internet being created actually by the Canadian government so that Iranians can more easily access and find each other online for kind of creating more social change. And so the role of the citizen in my country, which is the United States, there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of apathy right now, and sort of this sense that since the financial crisis, the economic system has really failed a lot of everyday Americans. And if you followed the Occupy Wall Street movement, it really kind of came to a head a few years ago, and there was so much energy, and then it didn't have the ability to really sustain itself into and inject itself into the political process. And so now I think we're trying to think about, many organizers in the United States are trying to think about how do we do that, especially this year. And I think that because it'll be an election year in 2016 in the United States. And so, and the campaigning has already started. So there's a lot of figuring out, you know, what are the core issues and how do we do that through the political process? And then to your point, how do we also do that through the influencing businesses? You know, how can people influence businesses based on their investment choices and consumer choices?
Yes.
Yeah, and I mean, the whole kind of future we're moving into is obviously much more like a sharing economy. And I think if you look at companies today like Uber, Airbnb, which is kind of totally new business models based on the fact that people are connected. We will see a lot more of that going forward. And the good thing about both these examples is that it is good for sustainability. You know, Uber just take a lot of resources away from the roads because we can share the cars instead of having, you know, one car each of us. So I mean, it is a lot of potential in the sharing economy, which will be enabled through basically connectivity and the fact that it is more people today that have access to a mobile phone that have access to water and sanitation. So that changed everything.
Right. Heather, could you mention some of the specific tools or digital tools that are out there or that you've been involved with that can help the citizen?
So sure, on the sustainability side, I co-founded an organization last year called Here Now, and what it's designed to do is basically be an overlay and an umbrella over and with a lot of the other citizen participation and traditional NGOs focused on climate change. And so what Here Now is designed to do is to help quickly organize to respond to different environmental issues and policy issues over this year, because we have the COP in Paris in December. And so what it does is it allows for people to self-organize. We kind of put out, I'm now only an advisor to it, I don't work on it day to day, but but people who are there day to day basically put out what we call ownerless memes. So how do you start hashtags or get social media conversations to start trending around different environmental issues? So I think they did one a couple of weeks ago called Climate Change is Real, which I know for Europeans is like, didn't we talk about that in 1985? But in America, we're still kind of grappling with these issues. And it wound up having a huge effect on social media to kind of start the conversation. So how do we work with, and Barack Obama was tweeting it out, and we got lots of other organizations in the US to participate, and it really just helps to elevate the conversation quickly in a way that it might not get as much airtime, so we can just be injecting into the culture over and over and over again that climate change is real, guys, and we need to do something about it. And so, but it doesn't kind of do all of the pieces, right? So it doesn't directly try to influence policy, but more is just a tool for social media to activate people.
Are you optimistic about the possibility of these technologies to really influence?
Yeah, I am. I think that I've seen things go incredibly well and be, things that are happening from a policy perspective can really be supported and engaged. You can engage more people over time and develop communities online, that things can kind of go from people find out about things online and then they're able to organize offline and kind of go back and forth, and it helps things spread. And I do think, just very quickly, that the organization that I was with for several years did a lot of work to create online social campaigns on the Gay Marriage Act, which is in the United States. So with the ACLU, so state by state, the ACLU was suing the states to legalize gay marriage. And I think that, we shouldn't underestimate the sort of value of millennials and young people online kind of taking action and getting involved.
That had a real result.
Yeah.
That did, yeah. Ernst, I'd like to ask you now about how things look more globally, look from the Club of Rome's perspective as we're heading now toward Paris, and how the dynamics are, kind of at the interstate level for making progress.
I'm afraid here I'm very skeptic. I don't see anything like a satisfactory outcome of the Paris conference. The US is not joining anyway. That's a fact. The American Congress is determined not to join. They have a 100-0 decision in 1997 not to join a climate agreement, unless and until the developing countries will also join. And they always say, well, it's the fault of the North having created that whole mess, and until we are as rich as they, we will not join. Therefore, we are in a complete stalemate, and the Europeans are badly left alone, together with small island states. This is the present situation on climate. I mean, if I was in America, I would be like you, would say, well, forget Congress. Let business and people and social media do the job. But this doesn't help the climate convention. So the prospect is bleak. And then on you, I mean, I love that the Norske Veritas is doing very good business, including in reducing energy demand and all that. This is great. But how about Shell or BP or the coal industries? Or how about Kuwait? You remember that spot on Michael's graph? Or more than half of the African countries, essentially they live from selling nature. And it's gone afterwards. It's burnt. And the business community loves those companies that sell nature. So for all my agreement with your motives and experiences, the general structure is short-term for most, and social media is accelerating things into short-term, you know? In some cases, for all social purposes, this is lovely. But in terms of long-term, it's a disaster. So we have to rebalance short and long-term, state and capital, etc. And this is a huge task.
Did you find the agreement between the US and China of some months ago, it was a notional agreement, but on some kind of capping of emissions, in any way a hopeful sign, or how would you put that into context?
In terms of global psychology, it was great, because the two biggest emitting countries were joining on stabilization. But in reality, the US were essentially selling the fracking successes, gas instead of coal. And this is not necessarily good for the environment. Essentially, it means digging out more. And the Chinese were essentially selling their scare of peak coal. They know they can no longer get coal out of China's mines. By 2025 or so, it will peak. And therefore, they made a commitment and phrased it as a climate commitment of doing less emissions from 2025 on. And this whole thing was sold as a success for climate policy. Well, it was a success for egotistic, selfish, economic reasons, but sold as climate.
So you don't see it having any impetus for Paris, really? It's sort of a...
Well, psychologically it does, because the old rule doesn't hold any longer that China and the US are not doing anything. Then you can say, well, they do something, and therefore the others should also.
So that's... Maybe we'll conclude on that guardedly positive note. It's clear that, you know, we're going to need a lot of cooperation among governments, business, citizens, private sector, and I think what you're all involved with here is all very important elements of the challenges we face. And I want to thank our panel very much for their insights today. Ernst, Heather, and Bjørn.